honest, critical decisions. In that sense of education. Not you're going to get a master's in such and such so you can get a good job. No. But education in general. So that you can develop your mind. You know, that's one of the attributes of God that we share, being made to the image and likeness, is a mind. And knowing, that is. And you know, if we don't develop our minds, we're literally going to go crazy. Because the mind is just crying out to be developed. And that's what education is all about. Now, different times in history, etc., then you focus education, all this type of thing, that's all true. But still, that's the basic bottom line. What is education all about? And then 5 is work. Not because if you don't have work, you're not going to eat, no. But because work is the use of the gifts and the talents we each one have received from Creator God, made to Creator God's image and likeness and chosen to be daughters, sons, gifts that we have been given to work with Creator God in the continuation of creation. A person who does a real good piece of work on this is a fellow named E.F. Schumacher, who died before his time as an economist, a German economist who left Germany in the time of Hitler, became a British citizen, simply because he was embarrassed at what the whole Nazi system was doing. And a brilliant fellow. And he had that kind of brilliance that's very basic and very simple. He could break things down and explain very well. And as an economist, you get somebody that is an economist who can break things down and explain well. That you got yourself a handful there, and hang on to it because it's special. He wrote a little book called Small is Beautiful, the subtitle, Economics as If People Mattered. There's a whole chapter on Hindu economics. It's a little hard to read, I thought, but it has some real insights. And he wrote another book entitled simply Good Work. And that's the one where he does a bang-up job. He touches on it, small is beautiful. But I thought in Good Work, he really puts forth this idea of the use of gifts to help continue creation. And so these are the areas that we are going to be working in. Now there's one thing here, I'm going to add one more, and that is the right to worship Creator according to our own cultural milieu. I think that this is very important. It's something recently now being talked about by scripture scholars and theologians, the enculturation of the Gospels. In other words, we read the Gospel in different cultures, from different aspects and strengths and weaknesses and points. Not that the Gospels change, not at all, but our understanding and appreciation and application to our own lives is much more effective when done from our own cultural milieu or background. And so, worship based on our own cultural thing. We've been blessed here, coming in from outside, the way the Mayan people relate to the transcendental. You know, we people from our own, we call it Western, or I'm going to call it what I think it is, and that's the based on Lenski's observations, and that is the industrialized culture of our day and age. The industrialized culture. We go to God vertically. We know Creator God through the book. We study, we learn about God from the Bible. And that's these faith writings prior to the coming of Jesus and then after Jesus went back to heaven. Help us understand and appreciate what is vertical. And it's good, obviously, but it's a struggle. It's hard. And so we keep trying to work at it and trying to work at it. And you run into problems. like the Greeks are going to get after you, and they're going to say, hey, define God. And from the Hebrew scriptures, we're going to have to say, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. Because once you define God, you limit. Greater, the Creator God, is not limitable, it's limitless. Yeah, but if you don't define, you can't know. We can't use our analytical syllogistic system to know. And so the author works hard at it, and in that first letter, I think it's the first letter of John, maybe the second, the first letter, where the author says, God is love. And there you go after it. Well, if that's a definition, well, maybe. But what does that mean? God is love. Well, the Mayan people's relationship with the transcendental, I'd like to say, is horizontal. They see God as creator. They see themselves as part of creation because we're created. But the Creator is part of creation because the Creator is creating. And so we're all in the kettle of soup together. And one of the fine symbols of the cosmovision, of the vision of the Maya, the whole cosmovision, how do you say that in English? What do you think?
Cosmology? Cosmology?
The cosmology, but the whole vision that we have of everything. It'll come in a minute. That I get that word. It's like unto that we're talking about. But the Mayan's symbol or figure is the spider web. And so the outside part of the spider web is Creator God that holds it all together. And that we are the people in the little connections inside. And we help hold it all together by having good connections. And those connections are relationships with one another, with community, with the ecosystem, with all the relationships that we live. And if those relationships are good and they're all connected, we're not putting an awful lot of pressure on Creator God. And worldview is the word I'm wanting, okay? The cosmovision, the worldview. And so they can see we are actively participating. If we don't, we put pressure on God, on Creator. And so their relationship is always a very personal one. They're after God. You got to help me here because if you don't, I can't. And if I can't, you're in trouble. And it's really basically that kind of a notion. And for us who know God vertically, is one of the ways I like to explain it. Well, that seems, oh no, we can't, we don't talk about God like that. God is too aloof. He's too supreme. He's too all-powerful. He's too omnipotent to be able to be dealt with in those terms. Well, the Maya people will say, well, you better deal with him in those terms, otherwise he's going to have trouble. And so that relationship with the transcendental has personally been very, very helpful to me. And so coming in to be able to share a little bit of that worldview and to share that little bit, that relationship with the transcendental, I think can enhance the one that I grew up with through the book. And so these are the areas we're attempting to work in. Now, how did we get into it? We could ask, how did the people, I'm going to do this one more thing and then I'm going to shut up and we're going to get a break. There's how is it the people don't have these? What has happened? If you have to have these to be made to the image and likeness of Creator, then what's happened to them? Well, I'm sure that there are about as many different ways of looking at that have brought this to a downfall as you can. One of the writers on it who does a good job, I think, is a fellow named Zurek. And Ted introduced me to him. He's a paleontologist. And that's a big word for a fellow that's hard to understand. when he writes. But he's a fascinating writer, and a very good one. But again, he's so brilliant that he footnotes everything. And so it's a big, thick book, and every third word has at least one footnote. And the footnote is really interesting. So it takes you forever to read it, but it's delightful. And the first book that Connie's husband, Ted Ning, Dr. Ted Ning, got me involved in is a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And maybe some of you had a chance to look at it. It's the beginnings of the human race. And he chooses 3 different places: Africa, China, and then of course the Fertile Crescent. And so but it's fascinating. Well, he wrote one not too long ago. I don't know if it's the last one he wrote, or maybe it is. He's getting up in age. And it's called simply Collapse. Again, it's the same style. And the research is incredible and interesting. And he talks about the demise of different cultures. He uses the term civilization when he talks about this. And so it's a kind of a combination of culture and lifestyle, life way and lifestyle together. And it's interestingly enough, amongst the Maya, he talks about all of the demise of these civilizations, as he speaks of them, pretty much has to do with the loss of trees, of all things, because of the imbalance in the ecosystem that comes about from the loss of trees. And amongst Maya, it was very much so. One of the things that happened within the Mayan culture, within their golden age, is they saw both civil and religious authority as persons who had a special contact with Creator God. And so they could go to Creator God in the name of the hoi polloi of the masses and get what the masses needed to live a good life with. And basically, for the Mayas, that would have been good routes of commerce, but more important still, good crops, especially corn. Okay? Well, the way that the religious and civil authorities stayed in power and to maintain that contact, that they told the hoi polloi, in order to get the contact with the transcendental, we have to have these things to be able to convince the transcendental to get you what you need. And one of the things they got into building was these magnificent temples. And how are you going to get those huge rocks way up there when you don't have derricks? And that was sliding and rolling on logs. And so once the trees were taken off the surface ground, well, you would be able, that wasn't as bad as it could be, because you still had the flat ground and you weren't eroding it all over the place, and you were using a slash and burn type of agriculture anyway, and it was going fine. But once you started to run short and you had to go up the mountains, then 2 things were happening. First of all, with the lesser transpiration of waters that trees do, the roots take it out, run it through the trunk, through the leaves, get it up into the atmosphere so it can rain again. They're also causing erosion because there's nothing to hold the soil in place. So you got the erosion, the lack of rain. And then you couldn't grow the food that you needed. And so the religious and civil authorities obviously didn't have the contact with the transcendental, Creator God, as they all claim to be, and were being fooled, were being worked to death, and starved to death at the same time. So this kind of leadership is not good, so we kill them. Get rid of them. And then in so doing, that lets the vacuum in leadership. And so, slowly but surely, demise. Well, I don't have any reason why I should doubt that input by Jared Diamond. Maybe there are other things too, I'm sure. But Diamond, being who he is, and his background in studies and his research, has something very different to offer. Well, when the Mayas were at a terrible demise in their history, is when we moved right into the era of discovery, the age of discovery. You know, that was a fascinating time. Late 14, 1500, early 1600s. And we had these people that were living on the ocean, in what we call today Europe. That'd be Britain, and the Holland areas, the low countries, as we call them, Spain, Italy, even Germany and its access to the sea through the rivers. They built empires. They built empires all around the world. And these empires are built in the knowledge that the world is not flat, but round. So if you go in one direction long enough and far enough, you're going to come to your own back door. And so the process of going to show that the world is round. And you're bumping into these land masses. And on these land masses, you've got this strange creature. It looks like a person. It walks like a person. It waves like a person. But that's all. The rest of it is awfully strange. It talks funny. It eats funny things. It dresses funny. It has a funny relationship with the transcendental. And so, it's not civilized. But we know the earth is round, and we're shown that. And we are civilized. So we definitely have to help these people. Now I want to put this in what would be, how else are you going to react? You haven't had an opportunity to express and to learn about all kinds of different cultures in the world. And so when you see something that is different, then it's different from us. We're the norm. we're the paradigm. We're the model. And so anything else is strange. It's uncivilized. After all that Spain wanted from this part of the world that it could come loose, gold and silver and that kind of stuff. Then all they had left were these large, massive lands, pieces of land. Huh. Good stuff. Really good stuff. Thank you. Thanks much. But that's all they had. So they gave it to their friends, the crown. And then they said to their friends, we're giving you these large tracts of land, you're going to have to give us something in return. And so we want you to civilize our new subjects. So you receive, you are friends, and we want you then to reach out to these new subjects of ours, and we want you to civilize them so that they can be good subjects. And they, in gratitude for being civilized, will work for you. And so that gave the people now an opportunity to use these large tracts of very fertile land to raise one or all three of the crops that were very marketable in the European market at that time. And they all, each one of the crops did an awful lot of hand labor. And they were cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco. Well, you can well imagine what happened with this and the people working it. The human condition being as it is, all kinds of corruption and abuse came in. Now the civilization process was basically teaching the subjects a civilized language, civilized customs or traditions, and a civilized religion. In Spain, being a strong Catholic, Roman Catholic country, sent priests to do this religion stuff, and a lot of it language, a lot of the whole civilization process. Well, one of them, well, there were several who became bishops that objected severely to this. They didn't come with that intention, they came to civilize. But as they came to know the people, they changed. And one of the greats on that was a fellow named, that saw the abuse, Bartolomé de las Casas. He became bishop in Chiapas, in Mexico. He's a very close friend of the crown. So when he and several other bishops got together and were talking about the need to change this, he was the one chosen to go back to Spain because their letters were not being responded to. And every day, whatever kind of communication they could get, to get into the crown and tell them that this is terrible. People are being abused severely, and it's not right. The problem is not that the people are not civilized. The problem is we don't understand them. They are of a culture different from our own. That's all. Now, they also happen to be at the low ebb of their cultural history. And so we could call it simply they're poor. But that's the reality. It's not uncivilized. Change it. Well, De las Casas was not able to get in, and he died waiting to get into the crown, get some changes made up.
What year was that? Or what general time was that?
1600s. De las Casas, there's a great book done by Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology, and just simply called Las Casas. It's a great big thick book. But this is one of those that you can get offered to write a book report on that and take it to class every day because it's big. The thing is, it's a very fast read. And no doubt, on a good weekend and a couple of hoagies from Devani's, you can get that thing read and written. A good book report read. But carry that book to class so that it's impressive. And it's fascinating to see what he does. If you people from other part of the world don't know what Devani's is, you're missing something. You go to St. Paul. You go over on Grand and Great. And if you get sick of hoagies, try the pizza. It's wonderful. Las Casas, Bartolomé de las Casas, put together by Gustavo Gutierrez. Well, this system is called encomienda. Or recomienda, the most commonly used term, encomienda. Simply a meaning a little difficult to put into English. It's take care of this for me, handle this for me. I've purchased this item at Schoenemann's in downtown. Send it on out to 1294 West Minnehaha. That's my encomienda. Would you send out my encomienda? Now, that system, as you can see, is not only very oppressive, because it doesn't let people be who they can be, does not allow them to live their culture, but it's also very abusive, because again, they're not recognized as, here we go again, others made to the image and likeness of Creator and chosen to be daughters and sons, like us. So, if there would be a question or so on this, otherwise let's take a break, say about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll finish up with some stuff. Okay? Encomienda system was not just here in Central America, Latin America, but many other parts of the world. It may be called different things, colonization in one of them, but in Africa. But it's one of those situations. Now, can you blame people? Can you condemn for it? It's part of growth in history. Was it a good thing? No. Did people realize that it was bad? No. Did they want to destroy people in the process? No. It was just one of those kinds of situations that happened. So we go from there. Now, when we came into the country in 1963, this system was still in vogue, but under the title of not land grants, but fincas or plantations, large plantations. Interestingly enough, a young woman not too many years ago, and certainly it's not 10, but did a doctoral thesis out of the University in Madrid following the Spanish land grants from the age of discovery to today. And she found here in Guatemala that the major part of those grants were still in the hands of heirs of the original recipients. And so in a country like Guatemala, with one resource apart from the people, his land, his soil. It was lived in and handled, and a culture, a tradition built on the soil, on the relationship with Mother Earth. And all that was so part of this country and the people of this country, that relationship with the soil. So now, when that no longer is possible for them, or they're relayed only by workers, and then carried on for so many years, and even at this time, you can imagine what that'll do to a people, Now this system lived in the plantations. The people lived on a plantation they were called colonos, and they were responsible to the owner, the administrators, to work it. They did receive a small salary. It certainly wasn't a salary that would give them a chance to become independent in any way whatsoever. And there was a simple house on the plantation that the owner was responsible to make available. By law, he was supposed to make a certain amount of health care and education. And of course, that was a doctor every once in a while, or else there was a person who was pretty good with something, with dealing with natural medicines amongst the people living on the plantation. Or maybe there was a public health center not too far off. Education, if any, was learning a little Spanish with the little tykes by somebody who really wasn't a prepared teacher. And then the work. The difficulty is, one of the key difficulties, is the people had no option. If they did not do exactly as they were told, if they would cross the administrator or owner in any way whatsoever, real or feigned, they were kicked off. And if they were kicked off, they were out. They had nothing. They had no place to go. And if it was something that was very detrimental to the plantation or to society as seen through the eyes of the owner or administrator, they could put the word out. They'd never get another job in another plantation in the area. So, and literally speaking, they'd be living the rest of their lives in the road ditch. And so, that kind of a system with little or no options was extremely, extremely difficult. That's what we came into. Now, just to give you an idea of what happened over the next couple of years, now I'm going to see how we got here and how we were not prepared. Come the year 1967, and this big conference that the bishops of Latin America had in Medellin, Colombia, the city of Medellin. And what the bishops of Latin America were gathered for was to discuss the guidelines that were made available to them. This is important. Guidelines from the Second Vatican Council. I'm sure most of you have heard it. Well, that finished in 64-5, and then these guidelines were made available. Interestingly enough, that was a council, one council in the history of the Roman Catholic Church that didn't come out with a bunch of dogmas or things you had to believe, or corrections made on some types of improper teaching of theology or philosophy, or improper dealings with the teachings about God, or about the saints, or about Mary, or whatever these types of things, church authority, etc. But this council didn't do that. It wanted to open the doors and the windows, thanks to John the 23rd, who got it started. And so they did offer guidelines for how to do the two things the bishops were primarily responsible for in their diocesan areas. And one of them was catechetics, or the other one was teaching the teachings and doings of Jesus. That was the basic work of a teaching bishop. How do we understand that what we're supposed to understand? And so they're dealing with the teachings and the doings of Jesus. Now, that we know by faith, that we understand by faith. And now, to get that faith into more of a human situation so we can appreciate it better, there's a process of intellectualization of that faith. And that we call catechetics. Okay, so the bishops had to deal with that. The council gave guidelines on how to deal with these two things. One, what we know by faith, then how do we intellectualize that? How do we get into the syllogistic system of thinking that we all use and dealing with all of our five senses? Now, liberation theologians were heavy into this. They would go through a process with people, especially people living in slums and living in conditions that were far beneath that of a dignified human being. And they would be asked, well, gee, do you people believe in God? Oh yeah, we believe in God. Do you believe that God is good? Oh yeah, God is good. We know that. We believe that. Does God love you? Oh yeah, God loves me and us. Yeah, we know that. How come you're living in hell? Oh, you never thought about that. And so that theologizing process is what liberation theologians built so much of what they have built and made available to us. And that's where that strong sense of social sin, people suffered so severely because they're not able to live the life way they wanted to live. That's that oppression. That is, you are subjects, you are uncivilized. Therefore, we have to civilize you. So when the bishops in Medellin started to use these guidelines to deal with what they had to deal with in the teaching of their people, they were asked, do we continue to deal with these teachings the way we have all done for so many years, 500, through the encomienda system? As the crown went to their friends and had their friends do the civilization of their new subjects. And we've been doing that directly and indirectly for all of these years. Do we continue? So do we teach the rich and the powerful and the learned and the understanding and the power structures of all of these countries? And then they will teach the colonos, the people that live in on the plantations. And of course the teaching is going to be filtered. But at the same time, that's what we're doing. Do we teach to the civil and religious authorities as we have them in the state now? Or do we make the preferential option for the poor and teach them directly also? Not that we neglect the wealthy and the powerful, but we also have a direct relationship with the poor, and that's going to be handled differently, of course. Well, this preferential option for the poor, one hands down. And the person behind this question and this discussion was a fellow named Gustavo Gutierrez, who was known as the father of liberation theology. Brilliant theologian, brilliant. Very unassuming, humble little fellow that worked in Recife, in the slums of Recife, and developed this real appreciation and understanding of how people develop the relationship with God and how that the Roman Catholic Church is obliged to deal with it. Well, you can imagine what's going to happen in these countries then. Then the Roman Catholic Church and all mainline religions, not the fundamentalistic evangelical types, but the mainline religions, the Lutherans and the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians, and we had some fine groups amongst them. Of course, we knew quite a few because most of them were Americans in their leadership, and we were able to get together and talk about things. especially up in Kesseltenango under the lighting of an ordained Presbyterian minister, and also a rural sociologist, Don Sibley was his name. Well, when this thing broke, all of those people with the strong Christian religions and their strong organization and unification of the people were subject to being the gateway to communism. And that's why all of that took place. Just boom. Well, all of these things were happening, and very early in our stay. And so, what happened to us coming in, and how did we get into things and deal with things as we try to appreciate and understand? And so allow me to go back a little bit so I could give you some of the ways we learned what we had to learn. And so programs like we have were able to be developed for good, bad, or indifferent, depends upon how they work. I personally am not a professional missionary. I don't belong to a religious community that deals with missionary work or crossing cultures, like Jesuits, Franciscans, and Marino, of course, in the United States, one of the very best. And so many of these other religious orders that have that very special branch and well-prepared people for it, understanding the difference in cultures and moving in. I am a diocesan priest, in the early 60s. The diocesan bishops were asked to help out because there were many dioceses being formed here in Latin America. And they had a lot of people, they had a lot of land, but they didn't have any personnel. And so the bishops here asked for help from the diocesan bishops at home. And many of them responded. And one that responded from here was our own bishop, a very pastoral somebody. The bishop would ask, is a fellow named Angelico Melotto, who was an Italian Franciscan of the missionary part of their order, and had been sent to with his group of people to China. And after just a little bit of preparation, and basically what they got to learn the language, the communists were moving in, taking over, and so they all had to leave. And his whole kit and caboodle was sent here to Guatemala. Well, Angelico Melotto then started to get after the American bishops to help out because he was named bishop of this diocese early in his stay, 1957, as this diocese was being formed. And so our diocese was formed in 1957, and our bishop there, Alphonse Schladweiler, was also was the first bishop of the diocese, and so he said, yeah, I will respond. So there was a priest who had been talking to him about getting involved in this and wanted to come. Bishop Schladweiler wanted to have a priest to accompany him, another foreigner, another American, for 5 years. And then after that, the one that was accompanying would come home and a new one would come down and take your place. So he said, after the priest that was ready to come, was preparing and coming down and looking over things a little bit, and he immediately said, the bishop sent out a letter asking for volunteers. Well, I was ordained in 1960, and I was teaching in the Central Catholic High School out in western Minnesota in the town of Marshall, and working in the parish there. And I loved it. I didn't want to change that for the world. I loved the teaching, classroom teaching. Old-fashioned kind, you know, where priests wore these big, intimidating black cassocks, and you'd walk in, and all the kids would say, oh. But I sure liked that, and I wanted to continue. So when the volunteer letter came, I threw it away because I didn't want to volunteer. Bishop came out for confirmations, and he said, say, Greg, that letter. Well, you know, Bishop, it said volunteer, and I really don't want to volunteer. I like doing what I'm doing. I'm going to do it the rest of my life. But so I didn't respond. Well, he said, you know, you're a young priest. You're supposed to respond to a letter from the bishop. Besides, what makes you think you're going to be chosen? Because there's so many people volunteering. But you should respond. Oh, geez. So I was all embarrassed and picked whatever you say. But I should have said in the first place. May of '63. You have been chosen. Wonderful letter. beautiful, something to save and show your mother every once in a while. I was the only one that wrote, nobody else wrote. Now what? Well, no preparation for mission. I did come down and got 3 months of study of language and culture in a Maryknoll school up in Wawetonanga, where they prepared their people, their final step for coming into the country. A very good little school, but only 3 months. But still, it's going to be okay. You didn't have to have the language or anything. You come down here and follow this priest around that wanted to be, and then you could go home and do what you wanted to do anyway. Well, I got here, and that priest had been called home because he was a member of the Minnesota National Guard as chaplain, and his division was going to Vietnam, so he had to go. So I ended up the only foreigner here for a year. Couldn't speak to the people because I couldn't understand the language. Couldn't understand what they were saying because I couldn't understand the language. And so you walk around like a dumbbell and smiling and saying "see" a lot. That's about all. Mass was in Latin at that time, thank God. We had to back to the people. And we were all dealing with the language no one of us understood any. But then when I'd have to turn around and read the scriptures in vernacular, I couldn't do that. Well, there was a woman, we didn't have many people coming to church then, but there was one, a woman named Mirtala Silada. And she could read. Her father was manager of a plantation outside, and as a young woman, she was helping the little kids learn a little Spanish. And so she'd say to me, you know, "Father, let me read that, please." So, God, so I'd sit down and listen hard to try and understand. I didn't realize it, but some years after that, a group of people came to me and said, "Father, we were just thinking about those first years when you were here, you know, and Mirtala had to read the scriptures in the vernacular because you couldn't do that." But all of us were thinking at that time, here this guy comes from the richest, most powerful, most dynamic nation known to humankind. And he's dumb, he can't even read. Well, what was happening then is slowly but surely, and I was the stranger, I was the outsider, so there are some places in town you didn't go into. You know, they'd spit on you and shout things. Shouting, there's no problem because I didn't understand what they were saying anyway. Just wave and smile. But some of the places were not good, and it just wasn't, you stayed away, that's all. But by far, the people were very patient, very kind, and very helpful. And so I've always did, as I mentioned earlier, I really have felt indebted. Because they could have put me on tarred and feathered me and put me on a rail and got me out of town. They had all the right in the world to. But then their teaching and my total and complete ignorance and the need to have somebody would patiently show me and what to do has been really a blessing. Really a blessing. And so all of that time, a mutual trust was growing. And I didn't realize it then, of course. But the trust, it had to be mutual. The trust that they had in me because I was too dumb to know anything, and so they had to teach me. And so they felt, good, we'll take care of him. He needs it. And then my trust in them because I was so grateful for them being patient and helping me. And the different ways that those things were brought home. Today, they've become stories. But they're not stories for the sake of stories. These are things that have happened, and over the years of thinking about them, reflecting about them, and talking about them, as any oral tradition will do, they'll kind of go into a story form, so it's easier to relate and easier to remember. But there's always the lesson there that is the key to the reason for the story and how the story then can make a positive impact. And again, it's that business of what you had to do to be of value to the people. And that was brought home so firmly by a grand old fellow from town, a fellow named Maximiliano Campa. He was a very regal somebody, tall for a Cachiquel Indian person. Actually, Margarito here's his grandfather. And the two young fellows in the office over there, Mario and Minor, their great-grandfather. Well, Don Max, as we all knew him, was one of these special kind of regal people of the wisdom part of the community. And he, like I mentioned, he was tall, and he liked to wear the traditional clothes of the Cachiquel community he originally came from, which is across the lake, a place called San Andres in Ecuador, which was in a homespun pullover shirt, and then the homespun trousers, with the long trousers, with a big red sash, and impressive clothing, impressive. And then the big sombrero because he was tall, and big sandaled feet. And he just had that stride. You just knew if he wasn't a king, somebody missed, and he should be. And he came to me one day, I was standing around up in front of church, and he said, Padre, what'd you come here for? I said, geez, Don Max, I think I'd like to serve the people. Looked for a minute and then walked away. Well, wasn't too long after that, he came again. He said, say, Padre, what'd you come here for? I'm wondering, that's strange. Passed away. But then, well, Don Max, I think I'd like to serve the people. Oh. And again, he turned and walked away. Well, I didn't know what was happening, but okay, so sometime after that, I don't have the exact distance between these episodes in time. But he came again and he said to me one more time, hey, Padre, what'd you come here for? I said, geez, Don Max, we've been through this a couple of times. So I don't know if I'm not answering right. I know my Spanish is not that good, but maybe, I think, Don Max, I'd like to serve the people. He left me, you know, Padre, I think you would. Now, if you want to serve my people, you have to learn something and never ever forget it. You have to learn to be patient with yourself and patient with my people. Learn that and remember it. Well, you know, I pretty well was dumbfounded, you know. I said, wow. And when he walked away this time, you know, I was trying to say thank you, but didn't really realize or understand. And my day during those years, we'd have Mass in Latin again at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then I'd go out and walk around town. I didn't know what else to do, just to look and see and whatever. And there wasn't much of a town at that time. There were only 7,000 people, not 20. And there weren't streets, there were paths. There was no lights, electricity, the water was not pumped from the lake. So you can imagine, it was just all the houses were made out of corn stalks and living in the middle of coffee fields. And I'd just walk around. And I noticed that almost every day Don Max would fall in step alongside me. And so doing, he'd tell me things. And this family that lives over in this CTO, such and such, and their names, and they came from, and their work, their children, all these kinds of things, about everything. And he was just teaching, talking about customs and traditions. And I always, you know, I didn't pay too much attention to it other than I found it interesting, you know, as such. And what he was hammering home to me was so terribly important. And slowly but surely, that there was some building up of understanding and appreciation. Then one day, his grandson, Jorge Lucia, came from his home was about a block and a half up the street. And he said, say, Padre, your friend Don Max wants to see you. Oh, right. So I went up, and there he was sitting on a small chair in the middle of this large room. And he had the sombrero turned over in front of him. And he was thumbing kernels of corn from near into the sombrero. And I could remember the first impression I had when he came into the door was he was a very tall fellow, and the chair was only about this high. That was most of the chairs in the homes. And he looked like an upside-down question mark. And, you know, not a very good thing to be thinking of. And then with his head, he kind of motioned me over to sit in front of him against the wall on a bench that was there. And I did that. And he just kept thumbing, one at a time. Said nothing, didn't recognize my presence other than the nod. And I thought, well, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I didn't understand something. I should let the poor man alone and get out of here. So I was about to say something while thanking him and then leaving when he said, hey, Padre, he said, you're my friend, aren't you? I said, yeah, I'm your friend. And he said, would you give me $50? Yeah, he said, would you give me $50? I said, geez, Max, what do you want $50? Well, he said, I'm going to die soon. In our culture, when an aged person dies, it's a fiesta because that person's going to go home to rest. And so at the wake, at the vigil for the night before burial, we have to have some coffee, we have to have some sugar, we have to have some bread, and we also have to have a little aguardiente because every once in a while there's somebody who likes to have a little drink. And he said, you know, that all costs money and I can't ask my kids because they don't have any money. I can't borrow it from you because I'm going to die and I can't. So would you give it to me? Well, I got into the business of the doctors and medicine and hospitals, and he just waited very patiently, and he said, Padre, you're my friend, aren't you? So here, here's your $50. Sure, glad to give you $50. Well, again, it was a time after that, and again, that part I don't remember on these incidences. I just remember those moments. Jorge came to me, that grandson. He said, say, Padre, your friend Don Max would like to have that blessing you give people who are going to die. So, holy smokes, what in heaven's name is this? So I went up, and there he was lying on the bedroom floor, and the blanket was up to his chin. And he motioned, he watched me with his eyes when I came to the door, and looking straight at the ceiling, he said, hey, Padre, would you give me that blessing you give people who are going to die? So there I am shocked, and I go into the whole doctor, medicine, hospital thing again. And he waited patiently. When I was all done with the harangue, he said, say, Padre, that blessing. So I had to kneel to anoint his forehead with holy oil, and I did that. And then when he was finished, when I was finished, he took his hand out from the blessing, from under the blanket, and he said, say, Padre, would you wait there a minute? I want to bless you. So he put his hand on my head. And again, still looking at the ceiling, he said, Creator God, bless this young man. Teach him to be patient with himself and patient with my people. He left his hand on my head for a moment. They took it away and put it back into the blanket. He said, you can go now. And so I stood up, and you can well imagine you're in shock. And then left. And about halfway back to the parish, I heard the running feet coming up behind me. It was Jorge. And before I even turned, he said, Padre, Padre, your friend Don Max just died. It was dark, and I thank God for that, because you can imagine. And it was Christmas Eve. It was Christmas Eve. And so Christmas, every year, is a special time of memories. And remembering a great person, great human being, who blessed me in so many ways. And taught me things as other people had taught, but taught in ways that that's the way it would happen. And I remember the teaching, but then over the years it's taken on these story forms, and that helps me remember even better. And when I reflect on them, and I do, it still brings them more home to me. And these other kinds of teachings in this whole encomienda system that we see in the plantations and the relationship between the rich and the powerful and the poor, it was obvious that our people, were struggling with hunger. And in those early years, I remember John F. Kennedy had gotten together with Hubert Humphrey, a senator from our state, and when Humphrey was on Congress, and they put together a Food for Peace program. What had happened was Kennedy, his last year on Congress before being elected president, was with the NASA Commission. And he made the statement, within a decade we'll be walking on the moon. In less than 10 years, Armstrong took that small step for humankind, small step for a person, huge step for humankind. But then in 1960, Kennedy said, well, within a decade will eliminate hunger from the world. Well, you know, that didn't work out too well. And today hunger is worse than it was then. But when that pursuit of that goal, Kennedy and Humphrey, and then of course the others, put together this Food for Peace program. And what they were doing is they had all of this good American food in powder form or flour form and in sacks. And there was cornmeal, soy meal, and powdered milk in flour form, 100-pound bags. And we'd get it through USAID and Caritas, Guatemala, Catholic Relief Services. Same thing with enriched white flour, and then cases of vegetable oil. And then we get so much each month, depending upon the number of people we're going to be able to feed. And we knew fully well that our people don't work with that type of flour, so we turned the soy and powdered milk and cornmeal mixture into a very rich breakfast drink, like a cream of wheat with kick that you could drink. Then we'd put in a little bit of sugar and cinnamon, and kids are going to drink anything with sugar and cinnamon. And so we would go around town and turn the flour into bread with the oil. Fell up the street here, Hirao Jacinto, had a nice big burro. We put a pack saddle on and 2 cream cans full of that breakfast drink and a big basket of bread. You'd stop at a corner, and the mothers would all come out with their containers and get this food for their children. Oh, I was proud of that program. You're hungry, we'll feed you. You betcha. And we'll handle this neat and clean. I took pictures, and I showed people pictures that would come to visit, even if they didn't want to see them. They got to see the pictures. And I'd tell them about how we're feeding the poor people and all of this. Wow, that was up. One day before class, our head of our auxiliary teachers, Ricardo Akpak, came and he said, "Hey, Padre, something happened at home today you're not going to believe." Oh, yeah? He said, "My wife, Wicha, came to me and she said, 'Say, Ricardo, did you notice anything different about the tortillas today?' And I said, 'You know, Wicha, you always make good tortillas. But today, it was different. They tasted better.' And she said, 'Yes, they were. It's the first time we've ever had tortillas made from corn we raised on our own land.'" I said, "Padre, you're not going to believe it, but it's true." And, you know, you try to be gracious. Say, "Oh, thank you for telling me all this. I didn't believe that. Of course, it's corn. Come on." And tortillas are tortillas. You know, if you don't have avocado with them, what are you going to do with a tortilla? And so I just didn't catch on. And he knew that. So the next day, he got another great mentor, Marcos Tun. Dr. Rafael Tun's dad, by the way, was one of the key people to teaching us. Only Marcos knew how to deal with gringos. You know, don't try and be subtle. They're not going to catch on. You just go right down the line, the head of the center of the road, and fast. So he came when Ricardo was with him, and they had another friend. I never could been able to remember that person's name. I don't remember who it was. But the 3 of them came, and Marcos was talking. He said, "Hey, Padre, thanks for your food. It's good. But don't give us your food. Help us buy land so we can produce our own food." And I talked about getting hit with a ton of brick. I should have known that. You know, being able to raise, process, produce, process, and prepare your own food as a culture, and then eat it when you want to, serve it and eat it the way you want to, and when. We take that for granted when we're going to go out to eat. It's going to be a little formal occasion. Let's celebrate their folks' wedding anniversary or some such thing. So the first thing you ask, well, what kind of food would you like to eat? What would you like to do? There's a new Chinese place out on 494. It's just great. Would you like to go out there? Or if, you know, down on West 7th, there's the Glockenspiel, and they do ham hocks and sauerkraut like nobody else. The best German food in the world. So we even identify food by the culture. And I did that. I should have known, but didn't. So that got us into helping people buy land. It also got us out of making drinkable cream of wheat with sugar and cinnamon. We've been able to help about 4,300 families get land on their own, up to 3 acres. Produce corn and beans, and then coffee is their cash crop. But it takes a long time, a long period of time. We just plain out and out help. We help get the land, and then they don't pay us back. You're starting from scratch. Here it is. Now start. You do something. If you can earn some money from it, then with extra food, with extra crop or extra food, then put it back in to make the land more productive. That's our whole idea. In 1988, Landivad University, a Jesuit university out of Guatemala City, very fine school. They had the students do a profile of Guatemala, and they published the results, the findings, in 3 magazine-style volumes. In the middle one, it said in this profile, we have found that it is a Mayan belief that tortillas made from corn you have raised on your own land, those are the 2 sine qua non, you gotta do that, make for better tasting and more nutritious tortillas. Plus, you get more tortillas per pound from that corn. Now obviously, that's not going to stand up to a scientific test. And just as obviously, there's no scientific test in the world that will stand up to a Mayan belief. And so, the need to appreciate and understand. And I think that those are the ways people could teach, because we were so subject to learning from them. We're so literally vulnerable. And not because we thought it was a good idea, not because we thought that we wanted to be that way. It was just the way it happened, because I got sent to a place I didn't want to be with no preparation, and became very, very dependent on the people. And so everything we do in every area to this day is based on that. And it's different from the way we usually deal with the people of this part of the world, and what we would call the third world. Terrible terminology. But this is, that terminology was developed in the height of the Cold War, when the U.S. was fighting with Russia and communism. 120 unaligned nations were gathered in Bucharest, or Budapest, one of those nations in Hungary, and they were asked, which do you prefer? The first world, which is democratic in government and capitalistic, neoliberalistic capitalism in economics, or do you prefer the second, which is communistic in government and socialistic in economics? And 2/3 of the people present said, we prefer a third way. We don't want either one. So they became the third world. But they weren't listened to. And to this day, they are the third world. What has happened? You know, as I mentioned just in passing earlier, that Gerard Lemsky, that cultural anthropologist of the late 60s and 70s, talks about 5 different categories of cultures. And let me touch on these so we can get a sense. And that is the hunters and gatherers. And you think, well, they don't exist anymore. Oh, yeah, the Maasai people and the Pygmy people of Africa, Bedouin people of the Arab world along the Amazon, they're hunters and gatherers. And then there's the simple horticulturists, the people who farm small plots of land up to 3 acres about, with wooden tools. The way the people of God, after the formation of 40 years in the desert, they were nomads, huh? And then when they crossed the river with Joshua and were given Canaan, they became simple horticulturists. Because then there are the advanced horticulturists, the same, small plots of ground, but working with metal tools and no moving parts. Maya people, those in the Chetes. And then there are the agrarian people That's the people who produce food the way we do, with mechanized equipment. And then the industrialists. Those are the people who make items from non-renewable resources using huge amounts of energy, and these items are to make our life better. That's the golden age culture of our era. That's the dominant. That is still democratic and neoliberalistic in economics, capitalism and economics. And and there are basically 8 of them. Now they talk about the group of 20 so often that I think that that's just to try to keep it away from just so few. But the 8 are Japan, Germany, Italy, France, and England, USA, Canada, and Russia. But they are the principal neoliberalistic capitalists, democratic, some form of democracy, governments. And you'll see them in the paper. They talk about them as the group of 7, the group of 8, sometimes the group of 20, because they like to include what they call emerging nations. Like, for instance, India. Take a real good look at India and see what's the difference between the very rich and powerful and the masses that are poor. And this new system of government economics supposed to help, it's not. But that's it. Anyway, the one thing about that form of capitalism that's a little bit scary is if it's neoliberalistic capitalism, the criteria for growth are good. What you use as a guide is profit. You gotta have profit in any business within our own system of economics. We understand that. But it's the care and the concern of the use and the care and concern of the acquiring of it that is very important. And that's where social justice comes in really strong.
Could you talk a little bit, Greg, about the civil